what is episode 3 of the 1 year later webinar series, a sequel to the new normal webinar series that we did about a year ago around this time. The title of today's conversation and webinar is the impact of the election on infrastructure and local government spending. So obviously over the past year and a half, our country has undergone a ton of forced change due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been quarantined. Businesses have been forced to shut down. We're now, at the point where vaccine distribution is scaling exponentially. Businesses are starting to open back up. And obviously, one sort of big elephant in the room is we have a new presidential administration as well. With that comes a whole host of new legislative priorities, different topics and areas that Congress is focused on funding, and that's really going to be the main sort of area that we discuss today, is the impact of the election on infrastructure and local government spending. We have a heavy hitter guest today that I'm really excited about, and I'm going to introduce him in a little bit. Very accomplished individual, but before I do so, a couple of quick housekeeping items. And I'm sorry if they sound familiar because you were an attendee of the past couple of weeks. The first one is this webinar will be available on demand after it concludes. So we'll post it on the eBuilder website 2 to 3 days, maybe even sooner after we're finished. So if you need to leave halfway through, we understand. This will be accessible on demand. Secondly, you will receive an email of a certificate of participation. So if your employer is requiring that, or a manager, you will receive that in your email inbox. One of my co-hosts today, Daniel Conery, Dan Conery for short, is going to be fielding Q&A questions throughout the entire show. So the entire sort of I guess you could say what the young people say vibe. The entire vibe of this show today will be very conversational and informal in format. So Dan and I will be poking the bear a little bit with Norm and engaging in frequent discussion and potentially even pushing back on several items. So the whole intent of this is not to be a lecture. It's a very open format sort of conversation. So on your right-hand side of the GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a questions tab or a bar where you can insert your questions as they come up throughout the conversation. We are first come, first serve. So we don't always get to all of them, but if you have something that pops into your mind, please submit it as soon as possible. But like I said, first come, first serve. So we hope to get to all of them. With that said, I am going to introduce our guest. Norm Anderson is the chairman and CEO of CGLA Infrastructure. He's a regular contributor to CNBC, Bloomberg, CBC, Fox Business News, literally every media conglomerate under the sun. You have probably seen his face on your television. An extremely accomplished individual, very in the know, plugged in with what's happening on the Hill in DC, and really has spent the better of, 3 decades now working in DC. So quite an accomplished individual. He even speaks 4 languages. He might even transition to different languages throughout this conversation if he wants to confuse us. So Norm, I gave the audience a little bit of a preface of you and your career, but why don't you tell us, a little bit about yourself in your own words?
Sure, I'll be really quick, and thanks for the introduction. I haven't worked in DC for 3 decades. My goodness, that would be horrible. I've lived around DC for 3 decades, but I work all over the place, all over the world and all over the US. So huge amount of traveling. What I like to do is talk to people and understand what their issues are. And our focus, I actually started the firm 34 years ago. The focus has always been on individual infrastructure projects, what it takes to get those projects moving, and who supports them, and how do you maximize the benefits of those projects. Just to give you a very quick overview of my career, the relevant part, I lived in Latin America for 5 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, and 9-hour bus ride, 7-hour walk into the jungle, living with Guarani Indians, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, first, second, and third grade in Guarani, which, by the way, is the answer to the trivia question: what's the second most used language in the world for scientific terminology after Latin? Is Guarani, because it was spoken all through the Amazon basin, down the coast of Brazil, and up into Paraguay, just in case anybody is faced with that question. One of the things I think is endlessly, I think there are a couple of things about infrastructure right now that are really, really relevant. One of them is that I see infrastructure leading the largest industrial change we have seen since the advent of the internal combustion engine. So this current period of digitization and electrification is a big deal. And the second part of that is that infrastructure all of a sudden becomes a first order priority. It's no longer the substrate that allows the economy to be productive. It becomes the brains of the economy. And increasingly, it's going to determine what I call what I stole from somebody, calling it the architecture of opportunity. It's going to be defined by infrastructure and how we design it and how well we do at implementing it and managing it going forward. So I suppose that's a good enough introduction. The other thing that is maybe relevant is that it doesn't matter how you invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure is a public good, right? Whether it's the private sector investing, it's a public good. And so, you know, my office right here, right now, is right across the street from the White House, because there really is an intersection between what we try to do with infrastructure and public policy. And if you believe that now is the biggest change in 120 years, which it is, so you have to believe that, it means that public policy needs to change and our institutions need to change and adapt. So there's a lot to, I suppose, unpack, Evan, in terms of this conversation. So that's my introduction, and hopefully I've worked through all your first 25, 30 questions, and we can move on from there.
Well, I want to sort of start with a softball question. We're day 90 or 91, I think, into the Biden administration. Obviously, the stimulus was sort of priority number one, the stimulus package that recently passed Congress and was signed into law. It's clear that the infrastructure bill is now the next sort of legislative big item of, you know, that Biden wants to pass. What's really interesting about this conversation is it's very real time. Like, news could break next hour, you know, that the Republicans have put forth, you know, a counter proposal. We'll see. We're seeing numbers. I think I saw numbers yesterday that the Republicans had countered with 800 billion. I know Biden has gone up to 4 trillion. I know some moderate Senate Democrats said even up to 4 trillion. I think Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia said that this past week. So let me start you off with a sort of softball question. Why is infrastructure spending a priority right now for the Biden administration?
How is that a softball question?
Well, I guess it's not a question. I lied.
What's really interesting is that we are so overdue for a strategic infrastructure initiative. And, you know, if you start to connect the dots, Evan, and in terms of what I just said, in terms of what different people see in terms of their needs around infrastructure, it really is a first priority issue, a first level issue. So the trick here is to figure out if there's any evidence that the Biden administration is actually going to be successful with an infrastructure initiative. Because why is it an important issue? It's an important issue because, you know, our average infrastructure assets are between 50 and 60 years old. We have about $40 trillion, almost twice our GDP, invested in infrastructure. Those are old assets, as I said. But, you know, when I ask you what infrastructure means, it doesn't mean the same thing as it probably meant to Joe Biden when he was talking about Build Back Better, which he doesn't do anymore. it all of a sudden means a lot more of the things that I was talking about earlier, digitization and electrification, so 5G, AI, that kind of thing. So we're really looking at figuring out how to organize ourselves and organize a country strategy for the future while satisfying some of the urgent needs of our citizens. It's a real balancing act. But do we need infrastructure? Yes. Does infrastructure bring a lot of your priorities and my priorities and Dan's priorities together? It certainly does. So the issue around do we need infrastructure? Why an infrastructure initiative? Why is it number 2 is important? But the other part of that is that when you say we're at day 91, that worries me a lot, right? Because you want to get infrastructure out of the box a lot earlier than the first 100 days. You want to be blowing and going. And so I think there's a significant sense of urgency in the White House to get this thing moving. And I think that there's a pretty significant sense of urgency in the Congress to get this thing moving, whatever this thing is.
So if I could jump in, Evan, real quick. So you talk about digitization and electrification. So why don't you define for us infrastructure? It's a very small word that can mean a lot of things. What do you define infrastructure as?
So I go pretty far toward the Biden definition of infrastructure in terms of anything having to do with transportation of people and also molecules, things with molecules, but also anything having to do with energy and the generation of electrons, the transmission of electrons, the delivery of electrons, especially renewable energy to you, base load in terms of hydrogen, water, wastewater, huge part of what we do, plus travel by water. And then the third one is social infrastructure. For me, includes educational facilities, and it includes hospitals, medical facilities, and even clinics in rural areas connected to our system by broadband. So, and it involves all the ICT as well. So that's a broad, old definition of infrastructure. That's all included. But what it means going forward is the electrification of vehicles. It means autonomy. It means the generation of big data. It means the use of data the way we used to use gasoline in terms of either taxing it or putting a fee on data so that it provides revenue for the public sector to invest in new infrastructure and new capability as well. So the digitization, for instance, of our interstate highway system, where you would put 5G posts every 100 yards, and all of a sudden you create an autonomous speedway for trucks, which creates a logistics end-to-end system in the US, which then enables local advanced manufacturing and local advanced agriculture. So there's a big vision. You guys know that I just published a book called Vision, our Strategic Infrastructure Roadmap Forward. And the purpose of the book was to say that it's ours, it's us. I mentioned Guarani a minute ago, and it's the only language I know where when I say us, there's actually 2 different words for say us. I could say me without you guys, so that would be Washington without the country, or I could say Ore, which is all of us, right? And that's what I'm talking about. That vision brings us all together and pushes us forward in a direction where it looks to me we can all live a better life, designing the future that we want to live in. And I think that's a bipartisan vision.
So continuing on the theme of bipartisanship, obviously none of this matters, or this conversation doesn't even matter if the bill never passes. So I want to briefly spend time on this topic in question from a political strategy point of view. What is the Biden administration and what do Democrats in Congress need to do to ensure they have enough votes to make sure they have some of those more moderate Senate Democrats like Sinema from Arizona, Manchin from West Virginia, make sure they're on board to pass this sort of bill. So what needs to happen to make sure this passes the world of Congress?
I think the number one thing is that you have to get involved, and the people who are listening have to get involved. I was talking to Senator Warner a couple of years ago, and he said, "Look, Norm, if you really want to do this," I don't know if he said, "Look, Norm," I'm not sure he knew who I was. He said, "Look, buddy, if you want to do this, right, it requires people out in the country to talk to their congressmen and talk to their senators, because I can't convince these people in a vacuum, right?" And that's what's really, really important. You know, I'm not flogging my book, but another thing that I highlighted in the book, because I was trying to get at this point, is how can a great country continue to talk about infrastructure investment year after year? And, you know, you chop down a small Canadian forest every time there's an infrastructure initiative. And how can you do that and not do it and not get anything done? And I think the biggest answer to that question is people need to mobilize. You know, the people on this call need to mobilize and need to communicate as powerfully as they possibly can to their senators and congressmen that they need stuff. And then Washington has to come up with a strategy or a vision that brings all those ideas together into something that we can believe in. And just to give you guys a quick example, and I know the listeners are, or the viewers are very aware of this, the initial Biden stimulus has $360 billion in it that it's being distributed directly to counties across the US. But the rules aren't there in terms of how they can spend that money. And we're not thinking particularly clearly about what our priorities are either. And since everybody's stretched pretty thinly, some people are going to invest in water, some people are going to invest in repaving highways, some people are going to invest in the local library, the local school. We don't have a coherent strategy, but what we need, and what's really important, I think, is to make sure that people let their congressmen know, Republicans, Democrats, right down the middle, that this is in fact a priority. And guess what? You have to get something done. We don't care if you get everything done, but you've got to get something done this time.
Where do you think the number lands? I know I'm asking you to take a best guess sort of approach here, but are we talking 2 to 4 trillion? Are we talking less than 2 trillion? What's your best guess here?
Well, look, you know, we invest about, this is the way to think about it, I think. We invest about let's say $300 billion a year in infrastructure. Mm-hmm. But only about 30 to 40% of that is invested in new projects because our stuff is so old. 70% of that goes to old stuff, to operations and maintenance, just dealing with old stuff. So that's a big issue. So there's a triage issue in terms of what you invest in. The other big issue is that in 1956, well, actually as early as recently as 1980, about 70% of infrastructure spend came from the federal government, and that's about 30%, and 70% from the states and municipalities. So the almost the dirty little secret is people don't talk about the fact that we've silently shifted an enormous amount of the burden for infrastructure investment onto states and municipalities. Third issue that I think is extraordinary is when you talk about a lot of the infrastructure that's in the Biden plan, and I communicate that to them as well, is a lot of this is actually private investment. I mean, electric charging stations, wind projects, even transmission projects. So answer to your question, I think this thing lands at somewhere around, you know, $1.5 trillion. That's over 10 years for new infrastructure, not for operations and maintenance of old stuff. But I also think it gets plussed up pretty dramatically by increasing the room for pension fund investment in infrastructure projects. And there, I think you start to move to the $2.5 trillion figure. But we're, you know, again, with my book, right? But the book starts, it's Thanksgiving 2030, and believe it or not, we got it right in 2021. And that's the whole point, right? Can we get this thing right? And can we, and, if you think about pension fund investment in our infrastructure assets, again, renewable energy, electric charging stations, we're designing a highway project that has, it's $1 billion project that has about $200 million worth of revenue sources, new infrastructure project. You start to think about that and you realize that there's a giant role for pension funds, but if a pension fund invests in a project, that means I invested if I'm a pension fund owner. So there's a huge opportunity for us to be imaginative and creative and responsible, because the other issue, and I think this is increasingly on the shoulders of the Congress as they think about this bill, we've got $30 trillion in debt, which, by the way, we're passing on to the next 2 generations. That's not okay. So we've got to make very significant investments, but we've got to figure out how to smartly bring in long-term patient money to assist with those investments. This is a huge opportunity for this country right now.
Dan, did you want to jump in there? It looks like you had a question, or
No, I'm just wondering if we think about what's the government entity who's going to be the recipient of this funding. What is some of the guidance you can give to them as far as they're used to managing? Like you said, 70% is on the operations and maintenance side, 30% on new, and that could flip. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of money. How are you going to manage that money well? How are you going to spend it well? How are you going to have visibility and accountability to your constituents? Just what advice would you give to the government agencies on the call that are going to get this money?
Another softball question. That's easy, straightforward. Look, I think what's most interesting about a question like that, the position we're in right now, is that increasingly the conversation needs to turn to benefits, what the projects are producing for people, and really, I know this is messy, but engaging citizens in this conversation. And citizens, not as sort of from the NIMBY perspective, but from the user perspective, right? Really engaging people. One of the things I show my new employees every time we bring somebody to CGLA is I show the Steve Jobs YouTube video from 1997 when he just came back to Apple, and it was right before he was Saint Steve Jobs. And he was a failed business guy, right? He was a doubly failed business guy. And he's sitting on the table, and a guy gets up in the back and he says, "Mr. Jobs, you have just canceled this piece of software. You obviously don't know what you're doing. Why don't you tell us why you do that? Because you clearly don't understand your business." This guy literally said that to Steve Jobs. Can you imagine that? And by the way, could you tell us what you've been doing over these last couple of years? And you can see Steve Jobs, he takes a gulp of water and he's about to speak, and he takes another gulp of water. Then he sits down and he goes, we've got to figure out what the consumer wants. We've got to figure out what the client wants, and we've got to build things that way so we really delight consumers. And increasingly, Dan, I think that's the answer to your question, that we've had a kind of a mentality that infrastructure is so complicated, and it really focuses on getting this right from a technical point of view, and you forget that it's a product and it's a service, and every product and every service has as big an emotional component as it has a technical component. And the real point at the end of the day is to provide some sort of emotional satisfaction to your clients. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting and potentially transformative in terms of how we think about infrastructure. And it gets, either better or worse as you think about having how many sensors, how much data, upgrading your services in terms of a transit facility, in terms of its software, in terms of its rolling stock, in terms of the experience, in terms of ticketing machines every 6 months or every year. So everybody has a different experience all the time. The sort of mobility as a service piece of this increases dramatically. Think about what happens if we have water meters where you can actually tell the quality of the water when you turn on the tap. How dramatically would that change the way a water authority operated? That would also, if you did it right, ruin the bottled water industry, but that's a whole other issue.
I don't know about that. Living in Arizona, I'm not sure I want to know what the water quality is, but please continue.
No, but the point is absolutely right? Because one of the things that's happened, and one of the things that's taken so much pressure off of our need to provide investment to the public infrastructure owners, is the privatization of infrastructure services. Like I buy bottled water, right? All of this stuff, if you think about that, is we need water, so let's have the same quality of water for everybody. Broadband, let's make sure that everybody has that as well. We've got to figure out how to make sure that the global commons, that the US commons, that we're all treated the same, that we all have the same shot at accessing public infrastructure to accomplish what we want to accomplish in life, whether that's work, whether that's starting a business, whether that's having a decent amount of leisure time. And a lot of this stuff really depends on our creativity. It can't be stopped by the budget, because great projects attract a budget. Great projects solve problems that bring money to them. I mean, I'm thinking as I talk to you guys about the largest leisure company in the US. Do you guys know what that is? It's the Army Corps of Engineers. They have 600 reservoirs that we can use for leisure, hunting, fishing, boating, swimming. But all these reservoirs are 50 to 55 years old. They're dual purpose. A lot of them provide electricity or fresh water for communities, and they sell that water. Huge opportunities to reimagine how we invest and own and operate our assets.
So you've been speaking on this a little bit, or not a little bit, a lot of it, but I want to ask the question very specifically. How do you anticipate the funding will split? Which areas of our nation's infrastructure will receive the most? I know you mentioned, I think you mentioned intercity rail, broadband infrastructure. How is this going to be divvied up?
I think, in these kinds of exchanges, I'm supposed to be the voice of God to Moses. And that's a really interesting question, because just take transportation. If transportation is split the way it's been split traditionally, freight rail is private, highways get 80 to 90% of the budget, and transit gets 10 to 20% of the budget. That has to change pretty dramatically. We're doing a thought leadership report on transit right now, and what transit looks like when it comes out of the recession. And what you're seeing inevitably is that transit, there's not enough public money available to make our transit system healthy. So transit systems are going to have to come up with alternative sources of funding, whether it's land, air, value capture, or other different kinds of opportunities like performance contracts with the private sector. Look, what I would say is, to answer your question more specifically, is if you've looked at the Biden plan from when it started, which was a very traditional plan, straightforward answering your question, now it's in flux, and it looks like it's moving much more towards something that would allow us to at least compete with China on the digitization, electrification, advanced manufacturing, bring the supply chain home front. That means you invest more in logistics. That means you invest more in multimodal facilities. That means you invest more in intelligent highways. That's one of the things that we see happening increasingly. And we see the plan continuing to evolve as Congress gets involved. more towards this kind of job creation for the future rather than the way money's been distributed in the past. So hopefully that's a decent answer to your question, but I think smart new infrastructure is going to get a relatively larger proportion of budget than other infrastructure. And one more point just to make it very clear, and I think it's relevant to the audience, is if you think about infrastructure as the brains of the economy, that means artificial intelligence, it means big data, it means machine learning, but it really means empowerment of the individual, right? It means that we're going to figure out how to use all of that so people get what they want, can start businesses anywhere they want, whenever it makes sense to them. That's not how China thinks about this. China thinks about it from the top down. We think about it from the bottom up. We're in the same race as China, right? So unless we figure out how to compete better and invest more in AI, ML, big data, IoT related infrastructure assets, we're going to have problems. So that's where that's inevitably going to go. Last point along these lines, I think I already made a last point, but the last point is if we have $30 trillion in debt, that's a big deal. We have $30 trillion in pension fund assets. We're a pension fund superpower. There's no reason, if the Canadians can invest directly from their pension funds into infrastructure assets, why we can't do that too. And that doesn't mean it weakens the public sector. Going back to Dan's original question, that actually strengthens the public sector. The public sector becomes the manager, the performance architect, the transparency provider, and the people who hold investors' feet to the fire to make sure the assets actually perform the way they were promised to perform. And if you're going to technologize, digitize, electrify assets, that means over the next 20 or 30 years, their performance metrics are going to increase pretty radically going forward.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because the way you ended that topic is one of our questions from the audience, which has to do with the focus. What we're hearing in the media is about spend. How much money can we spend, but not a lot of time on how are we going to measure the return on that investment. So this is one of the gripes I know I have working in the private sector, is we constantly have to demonstrate that we're good stewards of capital and that we can demonstrate a better return on capital than you could putting it into a bond fund or putting it in somewhere else. So do you see anything that we can do as citizens to help flip that script and start to drive ROI conversations? So we're going to spend $2.5 trillion. How do we make sure that we make more than $2.5 trillion on that investment?
So what's really interesting about the conversation to me is that that's a really smart comment. And what I find is that people all over the country are worried sick about that exact question. And it's not just infrastructure professionals, it's everybody. I was talking to a county commissioner in Ohio a couple weeks ago, and he said, yeah, I'm getting more money this year than my entire budget was for last year. And hell, I'll take it and I'll figure out how to spend it, but I'm not happy about this. And I think I think there's two pieces here, and hopefully I'm answering your question, Dan. I think one piece is Washington has to do a much better job of listening to citizens, because citizens are really smart. Sort of the wisdom of the crowd makes a huge amount of sense. The other point is technology allows us to do a much better job of not just polling people, but monitoring performance and making the kinds of iterative changes to increase the performance, which, by the way, is a nice feedback loop back into citizens. That's what we're not doing. Everybody has one of these, and one of these is, every living American has, except for my granddaughter, who's like 4 weeks old, has a supercomputer in their hand, and the power of that's amazing, but the infrastructure community has not figured out how to use that yet, or even come close, right? And people are really good at making decisions about how, they're much better than Congress about making decisions about how public money should be spent, right? There's no way we should have $30 trillion in debt and be having a sort of an unhinged conversation about spend rather than investment.
Yeah, no, and I'll give it back to Evan, but you reminded me with that comment you made from the commissioner was a interaction I had with the chief engineer of a large tollway authority a couple of years ago, when they talked about for year after year, it was about $200 million they had to invest in infrastructure. And all of a sudden, in this instance, it was a state budget, not a federal budget, was passed, and it went to $1.4 billion almost overnight. And so one of the comments was to make sure they have the systems in place to manage a 7x increase in their spending. The approval processes were going to be different. It's a lot of money. The public is going to want to make sure you're spending that money well. So they understood that they needed people, they needed the process, and they needed the technology to deal with that. And that's one of the things that we're talking with our customers, is trying to prepare them for this influx of, great, you're going to go start all these projects. Do you have enough project managers on staff to even manage? In fact, I was surprised in our public sector clients that they have as much problems. In fact, I'd argue more problems spending the money they have. It's not about going over budget. It's not spending the budget you were given. So you raise taxes, you've raised this money, and then you find out you only spend half of it. And then the citizens get upset because why are you raising taxes if you're not spending the money we're already giving you? So anyways, not a question, just a reflection.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
So back to you, Evan.
You're on mute.
Oops, sorry, I was on mute. I pulled a not millennial move. Did you want to add anything to that comment or thought, Norm? Any feedback there?
Well, no, the only thing that I think is really interesting is you're talking about a different role for the public sector, and you're talking about an elevated role for the public sector. And you know, when I've looked at successful infrastructure initiatives around the world, when companies really transform their infrastructure sectors, Spain, for instance, from 1995 to 2006, you know, where all these giant companies appeared like ACS, or what happened in China, all sorts of different kinds of things happen. But one of the things that happens is trust emerges in terms of the public and private sectors, and in terms of engineering, construction companies, finance, and the public sector people, all getting along better, all having better lives, all getting stuff done quickly. That's one thing. You know, the other thing that strikes me as I listen to Dan is that, you know, our infrastructure system is so herky-jerky, it's unbelievable. So, you know, one country that I was working with, European country, they have feasibility studies out 20 years, so a pipeline of projects. So if they get extra money, they have a waterfall of projects that they're going to work on. And, you know, we're not allowed to do that. And I think that's a big problem. I think that's where the Biden initiative needs to hear people, especially people on this call from all over the country, to talk about how to think about a vision and some sort of a prioritization of infrastructure. And then the other part of it is the federal government needs to figure out how to play a role facilitating the process. The public sector's role isn't to block everything until there's no risk left. The public sector needs to facilitate, needs to drive innovation, needs to drive rapid, creative, imaginative, effective public investment in projects. It needs to, the rule-bound bureaucratic way of thinking about this simply doesn't make sense in an era of big data, when the people who have access to the data aren't actually at the top of the pyramid, they're in the middle of the pyramid. So it's really important to almost transform the way we think about infrastructure.
So I've got a couple of questions from the audience, and some of them were sort of answered, but I'm going to ask them outright. What do owners?
Questions twice.
What do owners need to do so they can best position themselves to be recipients of this estimated $2 trillion bill?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward right now. We are in an age of, we're either going to return to earmarks or we're going to return to pseudo earmarks. And the best way to communicate with Congress is to communicate through specific project requests, whether you get those projects approved or not. First of all, if they're good projects, there's a good chance you're going to get them approved. So they'll become priorities. But the second thing is you're really educating the Congress, especially right now. And let's be very, very clear. The level of thinking about infrastructure, we're infrastructure professionals, right? That's what we do. We spend our time thinking about projects and how to get this stuff done. Think about, let's say your mind, let's say you're not over invested in infrastructure, but you're an infrastructure professional. So 50% of your time is spent thinking about infrastructure. How much of a congressman's time is spent thinking about infrastructure? Maybe 0.001%. So you don't really want to overwhelm this group of people with subtleties. You want to overwhelm them with, if we don't get this thing, it's going to be collapse, and that's going to be a problem for you. And I think that kind of, because what happens is we tend to be respectful, but what you really want to do is let them connect the dots as they hear from all sorts of people about what this country needs in terms of priority. And I understand, I'm sure people are going, yeah, I can't exactly do that because I have a boss and the boss has a boss and we're not allowed to communicate directly. But I would say two things. One of them is Congress needs to do a much better job of creating channels to listen to people about infrastructure projects, and there are none right now. I mean, one of the good things, I suppose, about the year-long lockdown is I can Zoom all over the country to chambers of commerce, farmers groups, whatever, all the time. And the one constant is nobody listens to us, and there's no way for us to get our voice across. That's a big problem, and that's a vacuum that everybody is in the middle of right now. And almost, Dan, going back to one of the things that you said, I'm a big fan of state infrastructure banks, because I think what happens with an entity like that right now is that we're all siloed. I talk to my friends at the Department of Transportation here or someplace else, Department of Energy. Where does an electric vehicle sit? Right? Does it sit in transportation? Does it sit in the Department of Energy? How do you get that approved? You have to go all the way up to the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of Energy, get them to talk so that you can have a joint research project. How long does that take? And if you were to create robust state infrastructure banks, again, this is a moment of dramatic change. State infrastructure banks that could bring in pension fund money, perhaps, that could fund feasibility studies, that could help to provide expertise, that could bring in technologists to give people a sense of how they could increase the performance of their jobs, increase the transparency in terms of what's going on. Do that without violating all the wonderful procurement rules that we've built up, so that DOTs around the country don't have free access to the kind of information that the private sector people have. I mean, this is a time where creating effective institutions, all of us working together, is absolutely critical. That's what happens when you go through such a giant industrial change as we're going through right now. And a lot of the uncertainty around everything is because everything is moving. The forces that were pretty well set for the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years aren't set anymore.
So we have a funny question from the audience that I am personally interested in as well. And companies like Tesla are not going to like this question, but I'm going to ask it regardless. If you are thinking, or if I'm thinking, this is the person asking the question, if I'm thinking about purchasing, an electric vehicle or maybe adding solar to my home, should I be waiting for potentially a pending larger tax credit with this infrastructure bill? And then I'm going to add a second follow-up to this question is, what sort of presence will clean energy, clean sustainable energy have in this bill?
So,
So twofold, Tesla, if you're listening, please stop listening.
yeah, no, I got that. Listen, I just bought a Tesla, and I bought it as a science experiment. I mean, I'm just fascinated by learning, right? I mean, I get to be the smart guy talking about all this stuff, and so buy an electric vehicle and figure out what the data looks like, figure out what a charging station looks like. Watch what happens when you pull into a charging station and you're doing pretty good, and then 7 other cars pull in and you're not doing so good anymore. You're gonna be there for the rest of your life rather than 30 minutes. I mean, all sorts of interesting things happen. So for me, I thought about that a little bit for about a nanosecond, and I said, just buy a vehicle, learn, because that's really what's gonna happen here. So anyway, you're an early adopter, congratulations. Look, the renewable energy piece is actually fascinating from my point of view, because, and I was talking to a guy in the White House 2 weeks ago, and I said, look, you guys are talking like it's 2016 or 2010 or 2012, 2008 in terms of renewable energy is almost being a tax on the system. It's no longer a tax on the system. It's where all the innovation comes from. It's almost competitive with everything else. If we have a carbon tax, it's going to blow everything else out of the water. So the real question with renewable energy is, how do you base load it, probably through hydrogen? How do you base load it so it becomes reliable energy? And then how do you facilitate high voltage transmission lines so that it can get around the country easily, right? A friend of mine, Michael Skelly, went out of business trying to build windmills in Oklahoma, Texas, and then provide wind energy to the Midwest and to the east of the country, because no one would allow him to build a transmission line. So we've got the private sector, which would love to toll electrons, can toll electrons. The figures are fascinating. I think we've built 3 DC high voltage transmission lines in this country since 1978, something like that. The Chinese did 12 last year, right? So you have to stop being an ostrich with your head in the ground. We have to stop that. I mean, most of the people on this call are engineers, urban planners, people with a technical background. We know that we're not investing in the stuff that we should be investing in. And we also know that it's pretty straightforward to make those investments. So we've got to figure out how to get on with it for our children's sake and for our grandchildren's sake. That's the critical issue right now.
I know Dan has one last question, and I know we're running up against the time window, so we'll wrap on this.
Yeah, so
sorry for being preachy, Dan. I get carried away.
No, it's all good stuff. So really, this is around a general topic about sustainability, environmental impact, and making sure that there's equity in the distribution of these funds into, because a lot of this will end up going to the private companies to do all the building part of the new infrastructure. So any thoughts you have around balancing what we need, like you mentioned, the 12 lines put in 1 year by China. One of the things is, nobody owns property in China, so it's very easy. You don't need an eminent domain because the government owns it all. So you can put stuff into place very, very quickly. So, and then, so striking the balance on environmental impact, and then the equity component around making sure the money makes it to the maximum number of people possible.
So look, and I'll depoliticize the point by talking about a lot of my work overseas. One of the big problems in working on infrastructure internationally is that most infrastructure investment, the IMF has spent 30 years making it virtually impossible for governments to be able to make decisions, right? Because of public sector austerity. So a huge amount of private investment in infrastructure, or an increasing amount of infrastructure investment, tends to come from the private sector. But that's all IRR driven, right? So there's been virtually no extension of water, clean water, wastewater, et cetera, because you don't make any money off of that. Transit, almost nothing, because you don't make any money off of that. somehow I think one of the really interesting answers to your question, actually I think it's an answer to both of your questions, Dan, is that we need to figure out, and we're actually building an algorithm, but we need to focus on benefits and on maximizing and measuring benefits, figuring out what those are, and then maximizing benefits to the consumers in the watershed of that particular infrastructure project, whether it's a renewable project or whatever. And part of it may be jobs, part of it may be carbon, part of it may be national security. Those are conversations that we need to have around infrastructure, and you have to open up the sort of the can of worms, because obscurity, darkness doesn't actually promote debate. And this is a really good opportunity for us to talk about what we really mean by benefit. Why do we do projects? Let's go back to where Evan started the conversation. Why do we do projects? We do projects to generate maximum benefits for citizens so they can have better lives, either professionally or personally. That's why we do projects. So the benefits of projects are obviously critical, and it's critical that everybody get equal access to, my dad used to say that he was born in 1913. So think about that. He used to say, we used to talk about opportunity, right? And that's what you're really talking about, is an architecture of opportunity. That's what infrastructure builds, and you've got to maximize that infrastructure of opportunity. So all the legacy stuff and the legacy arguments, I think those are dead ends. I think the conversation is, how do we get on with it, all of us together? And I think that's focusing on benefits and on a broad and pretty specific algorithm around benefits is pretty interesting. It's not going to be an easy conversation, but it's going to be a much more interesting conversation than the one we're having right now.
Norm, thank you so much for joining today's conversation. Where can people read more about your work, follow what you're doing? Feel free to plug whatever you wish.
Oh, well, I'll plug my book.
I love it.
Our Strategic Infrastructure Roadmap Forward. Please, let's set a record today and download the book. It's less than $10 on Amazon. How do you like that? Or you can send an order for me for $25 and I'll send you a signed copy. So there you go. But on a more serious level, we've started something called the Strategic Infrastructure Performance Institute, a not-for-profit, and I'd love to get as many public sector participants engaged in this as possible, because the whole point is to focus on how to prioritize projects, how to think about innovation, especially technology innovation in our infrastructure, and then how to think about more imaginatively about how to fund our infrastructure, especially with a long-term view, so that we don't put an unnecessary burden on the future. So as much as I can do to, we're really facilitators in the sense that we want to build projects, but we want to make sure the country goes first. It's this idea of, if you build a common good, then everybody's going to have a better chance to have an individual good. That's really what we're all about. So anything we can do to facilitate that, super happy to do it.
Thanks again, Norm. This concludes our 1 year later webinar series. This was the third of 3 episodes. Thanks again to everybody who tuned in, asked questions, participated in our Q&A sessions. We're so grateful for each of you. Like we said, you will receive a certificate of completion in your email, and it will be available on the Builder website after this is concluded. So thanks again, Norm. Thank you, Dan, for participating in today's conversation. It's going to be an exciting few months in Congress. I know it is going to be a lot of back and forth. So thanks again, Norm, for joining today's conversation. And everybody, we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.